Thank you so much to everybody for those very kind introductions. Two introductions in one night. That's pretty nice. To all of the co-hosts and to the Mercury, it's just wonderful to see everybody and have everybody come out. I am going to keep my remarks fairly short so that we can have more of a dialogue and a conversation rather than me talking a lot. If you want to go in depth into what I think about things, you can buy the book. 224 pages or something like that. So you can have all of that. So I'm not going to make you endure a lot tonight, but I'm looking forward to the conversation and Q&A and dialogue that we have. The basic idea of the book was this: I've been a practitioner my whole life. I'm not an academic, but I have always loved history, and I would go into political battle every day. I've been in politics my entire adult life, and in fact was knocking on doors for George McGovern when I was 12 years old and lived in Nebraska. So I've kind of been in battle even before I became an adult. And what I would find when I would go home at night and open my history books, because I always loved reading history, was that the arguments were strikingly the same. That progressive-minded folks and conservatives have been basically arguing about the same basic ideas for the entire history of the country. You can just go down the list of issues. Sometimes the issues would change. Sometimes the names of the political parties would change. Sometimes the nature of corporations in America would change, or the role of the government. But basically, we were always arguing over a few key things. One was, do we take Jefferson's phrase about that we're all created equal seriously? And from the very beginning, there were folks who took that seriously and folks who didn't. And at times, not even Jefferson took it seriously in some of his life. But that idea was so profound that it motivated and stirred and created this whole debate in American history about whether we take that seriously or not. Second big thing we've always been arguing about from the very beginning was the nature of democracy itself. I talk in the book about how from the very beginning there were people like Tom Paine who were very excited about this new idea of a democracy and really helped invent it. And there were other people who fought it like crazy. I talk in the book about how Alexander Hamilton would get drunk at dinner parties and scream at people, "Democracy, it's a great beast!" He hated the idea of democracy, the idea that regular people would get to vote. It was an awful idea, and there were folks from the very beginning who didn't like it, and that is still true today. It's still true today. People think that we're sort of over some of these battles, that we've accepted equality, democracy, but we haven't. And I see it every day in my political work. The fights that we have with Republicans and conservatives about who gets to vote and whether people get to vote and whether the right to vote is taken seriously is still part of our political dialogue. Another thing we keep arguing about is the basic idea of do we have the people who are already rich and powerful just continue to run things since they do such a great job of it? Or do we have regular folks who really have a say in their government? And again, those ideas go deep into the American soul. Do we take seriously the idea that we are a country that is governed of the people, by the people, for the people, Or are we really just all about looking out for the people who are already rich, already powerful, already in control? And again, we fight about this over and over again, issue after issue, decade after decade. And I talk about that in my book. And then the idea, and all of these things, of course, are related, but the idea of what I call trickle-down versus bottom-up economics. And you would be amazed at how, from the 1770s on, people have been arguing the same things. Do we invest in regular people? Do we make sure that poor people can work their way up and have equal opportunities? That poor people can have education? That poor people can have jobs with decent wages? That middle-income people can create stable, good lives for their families? Or do we give all money and power and government control to the wealthy and have it be more of a trickle-down kind of system? And again, these are themes that go throughout American history. And so I trace those arguments as they began in 1776 all the way to the present day. And I also talk about something else that kind of came to me as I was writing the book, but which is very important for this moment today, which is that when change comes in America, it tends to happen in very big waves. What I ended up in the book calling big change moments. That there are just certain moments in American history where the problems get too big, the movements on the progressive side become stronger, progressive-minded politicians who are open to new ideas get elected, and the moment happens. And we saw that in the 1860s when slaves were freed and when these incredibly progressive constitutional amendments were passed that basically opened up the Bill of Rights to be enforced in all the states and not just state by state, whoever, based on the whim of whoever controlled things there. When we had the Homestead Act giving away free land to millions of poor people and land-grant universities allowing poor people to go to college for the first time. All of these things happened at once. And then again in the 1900s, where the corporate trusts started to be broken up and the national park system was formed and an income tax, progressive income tax, was passed. And all these things started bubbling up, and there was a wave of progressive thought and movement, and it culminated with women finally getting the right to vote after 70 years of struggle. Then again in the 30s, the New Deal, Social Security, the minimum wage, regulation of the banks, something that would have been useful the last few years. But all of it happened at once in this big wave, this big kind of tectonic plate shift in American history. And then it happened again in the 1960s, and some folks here were around for that, remember that. But it wasn't just... Some folks here were a part of it. But it wasn't just the movements of those times, but real things back then. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, legal services, environmental laws, women's rights laws. All these things happened in a rush. And I talk in the book that there are moments in American history where it all comes together. And we are long overdue for one of those moments. And I believe that things are lining up again where the problems are too big, the things that should have been done a long time ago haven't, and the problems have kept building. And we've got a revitalized progressive movement. When I compare what I see now with what I saw when I was in the Clinton administration, where there just was no push on the progressive side, and now there is. Now there's this growing sense that it's time to do something. And we've got an administration, we've got a Congress that I think is open to new ideas. But here's the thing, there's nothing inevitable. They have to be pushed. I was asked during the transition, I was the liaison in the transition, as I think Ellie mentioned, to the progressive community. And someone said, well, the progressive community doesn't seem very happy. And I said, it's not their job to be happy. Their job is to push and to push and to push. And I talk in the book, throughout history, progressive movements have found ways to push and yet also work constructively with the people in office. Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln fought like crazy sometimes, and Frederick Douglass condemned Abraham Lincoln at times in his speeches. But they also got together and they met and they talked and they worked out how to do the Emancipation Proclamation. John L. Lewis and Walter Reuther banged on FDR and pushed and pushed and pushed on FDR. Suffragists banged on Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and locked themselves in front of the gate at the White House and got thrown in jail and pushed and pushed. But they ended up working together to make women's suffrage happen. And of course in the 1960s, we pushed. The people in this room pushed, and the movement made things happen. Martin Luther King and LBJ, Martin Luther King and the Kennedys didn't always get along, but they worked together to pass those pieces of legislation on civil rights. And it was true on issue after issue. Those new movements blossomed. And so we need to keep pushing. There is nothing inevitable about change. We had an opportunity in the 1990s and we blew it. And we can't blow it again. We have to seize the day. We have to make it happen. We have to do it now. Because the moments don't come along very often. And if you lose the moment, like we did in the early 90s, you lose it for a generation. So here we are, a generation later. We got another moment. We got another chance. We just got to keep pushing. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for comments and questions.
Paul Krugman, writing in the Times 2 days ago, was talking about the centrist lobing of the country and the fact that it isn't that centrist. And there were only 3 Republicans who identified themselves as moderate. What country are we living in? Why, in your opinion, do so many more people that we would expect to get it don't get it?
Well, you know, it's interesting.
Sorry to ask the $1 million question.
No, it's a very important question, and I think the answer is that way too many of the people who don't get it live in Washington, D.C. There is and this has been very clear to me when I first moved there. A friend back home in Nebraska asked me about 6 months after I moved to Washington. I was working in the Clinton White House. And they said, so what of everything in Washington do you think is the most dysfunctional? You know, is it the bureaucracy of a given agency? Is it the Senate? Is it the House? Is it, you know, what is it? And I said, well, you know, from my perspective, it's big media. Big media has bought into this idea that bipartisanship is more important than actual solutions. And their version of centrism is a centrism that I don't recognize. It's a centrism that keeps moving to the right, ever to the right, and is corporate-centered centrism instead of actual centrism. I mean, I come from Nebraska, which is not the home of great liberals generally. But in Nebraska, you know, people there don't recognize the centrism talking about, because it's all based on elites and what's good for big business. It's not a centrism that actually relates to regular people in their everyday lives. And so that's one of the things that both Obama and the progressive movement are going to have to fight their way through. And I tell you something, this whole stimulus debate was a classic example of that. I mean, we were arguing about such stupid stuff when the whole fate of the country was at stake, and the media was obsessed with how many Republican votes we were going to get. The Republicans, of course, were having great fun, and they were talking about $25 million programs that they were describing as pork, you know, some of which weren't actually pork, many of which weren't. But they wanted to focus the country on that rather than the $100 billion going into public education, or the money going into green jobs, or all the investments that were being made. So the dialogue in Washington is very skewed by pundits who make a lot of money, get all these sort of corporate speaking gigs and corporate advertising, and they don't want to rock the boat for a lot of these big business special interests. Yeah.
How can we push, the progressive community push, if structurally we can't get 60 votes in the Senate, and we have to be a little more centrist with our policies?
Well, you know, I talked in the vote about the 60 vote issue, and I think there are a lot of ways to look at that, and I'm convinced that we've actually turned 60 vote thing into an excuse in a lot of cases. Now, that's not to say that we aren't going to have to compromise on some things, and we will. It's not to say that we don't need to reach out to Olympia Snowe to get her vote on a few things. But in fact, I'm convinced that there's so many things that can be done, even with Republican filibusters, that you know, through executive orders, through the budgetary process, or through just plain you know, good old-fashioned hardball on issues, you can get an amazing amount done. And if you want an example of that, look up George W. Bush, 2001 to 2006. I mean, he never had 60 votes either, and he ran through all kinds of stuff. So I'm convinced that there's a great deal that we can do even without doing that. I'm also convinced that where we can make compromises with reasonable Republicans like Snowe, there aren't very many left, but you know, folks like Snowe will be able to do that, or Specter on some labor issues. I mean, we have to pick people off issue by issue and make reasonable compromises. But I think there's a lot we can do even without having the 60th vote. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you started off equality and how that affected movements.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry. You started off with equality and how that affected this progressive movement and how it's sort of the foundation of the progressive movement. I know we've talked a lot about this left and right kind of perspective. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your opinion on how you think the left and the right, or some new category, might fit into the progressive movement. Since the progressive movement probably is, most of us are probably left people, you know, so how does that fit in terms of equality? Just like, what are these divisions of left and right?
Well, I'm not totally sure, but I'll attempt to answer what I think is where you're going. I think that progressives themselves, the left, have to make sure that equality is always central to not only their agenda but also their practice. There are way too many meetings and events where you don't have equality practiced in reality. There are way too many events where there are just very few people of color who are involved, not just sort of in the audience, but in the decision-making of what's going on. And I do think that one of the most exciting things about having Obama elected is that really is changing. I was telling the story to some folks the other day. There was a meeting I was in the transition where there were 20 people in the room, right? There were 16 people of color. There were, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians. There was a Native American, and there were 3 white women, and then there was me. And after the meeting was over, the guy who ran the meeting came up to me and said, "So do you know any other white guys? I feel like we ought to have some more white guys." That's the kind of administration. I mean, it's obviously a lot.
How did you answer?
I said I did know some white guys, but not.
They're done.
We need to build a movement that looks like the administration, where there are more and more people of color, where there are more and more women, and I think Obama is doing that to a great extent. To me, that's incredibly exciting to see. But we also, I think, within that, we have to make sure. For example, I'll give you another sort of classic example from both Clinton and Obama worlds, in that African Americans have done a great job through churches and through historically black colleges and universities of creating institutions that have allowed them to rise to the top more quickly. And as a result of that, in the Clinton White House, for example, there were a lot of African Americans, but very few Hispanics. And in Obama, that meeting I was talking about, a lot of African Americans, just a few Hispanics. So we have to be very conscious ourselves in thinking, okay, we've got a lot of people of color in the mix, but maybe not as many Hispanics as we should have. So how do we build institutions that help rise, get Hispanics to rise to the top? We need to be conscious about those strategies, because if we're not conscious about them, they don't tend to happen.
How about Asians and women?
Asians and women as well, although on the institution side of things, I see good signs of that. Asian Americans have I think, done a really good job of starting to build institutions for themselves, political organizations and institutions that have helped them move more quickly into the White House, into government jobs and other kinds of jobs. And I think to some extent that's also true with women. But it's a never-ending process. It's never going to just happen automatically. Hey.
Hey. I have sort of two questions. One is, when was there another period in American history where we saw the same type of culture war that we're seeing now, where you've got a Sarah Palin versus Barack Obama, two very different visions of what America should look like, and then, from that, how do you see the Republicans rebranding themselves based on, sort of history? What's the future look like for them?
Very interesting question in terms of what the future looks like for them. I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of the culture war thing, it's actually striking how often that kind of dynamic has happened. Amazingly enough, you go back and read the political debates of the 1860s, and they were absolutely stunning in terms of how far the radical Republicans, a little bit of irony to that phrase, but the radical Republicans of their day moved very, very quickly toward equality, equality of race, equality in a variety of ways, and were very open to having citizenship be based on more pure equality, having it include immigrants of different races, and the backlash that they got back was, of course, very blatant, much more blatant than it is today. But there were a lot of incredibly forward-thinking folks, Charles Sumner and folks like that, who were really amazing. In the 1960s, if you go back and read Rick Perlstein's amazing book, Nixonland, it's dramatic in terms of the culture war stuff that was going on in the 1960s and how open it was and how rabid it was on the conservative side, how they were not at all ready to accept the equality idea, and how far we've come since then, but very striking in terms of how openly racist they were and openly sexist they were. And I don't think that's. I think that there are times, and I think we're in a time right now in history where that gets more subtle, but I don't think it's ever very far beneath the surface. And I'll tell you this: the single thing that I fear the most about the next few years is that Obama doesn't succeed. The economy doesn't get better. That we keep running into trouble, and that based out of that, a really kind of nasty right-wing and racist backlash develops based on that, and the Sarah Palins of the world sort of say, well, see, this guy, he couldn't get it done, and it becomes a racial thing. And I think that could happen, and I think that's something that we're all going to have to fight against. I think it is so important for Obama to succeed. I don't think that means that we give him, the freedom to do whatever he wants, even if we disagree. I think we still have to keep pushing, but I think it's so important that he succeed, because I think the racist backlash, the culture war stuff, will get very ugly very fast if he doesn't.
Given ugly politics and immigration, what we have right now is new slavery in this country where people can adjust their status, and so they're essentially slaves here. Do you see the Obama administration being able to push a comprehensive immigration reform through in this term, or if not, what do you think needs to happen?
I'm actually more and more hopeful that they will be able to do it and prioritize doing it in this term. I'm getting some definite signals from my friends in the White House that they want to do it sooner rather than later, and that in fact it's moving up on the agenda rather than back, because what they're finding is on every single issue, immigration is sort of rearing its head. On S-chip, we saw the fight on S-chip, and Obama insisted that S-chip include children of immigrants. But that fight got ugly because of that issue. Healthcare is going to be the same kind of way, and so the thinking more and more that I see is that they want to move relatively early on immigration reform and try to get it at least somewhat resolved sooner rather than later. I hope that's the case, because you're absolutely right. It's just one of those issues that's just sitting there and festering, and what's happening to the people who are victimized, as you're talking about, people who are virtual slaves, is horrible. But it also creates problems with our politics. And one of the things I do in the book is I contrast quotes from people on issues like immigration, quotes from people in the 1920s and the 1870s with quotes today, and they don't sound very much different. The anti-immigrant folks of today, they don't really sound any different than the folks who were doing these horrible things back in the 1920s or the 1870s or 80s. So the sooner we can resolve this issue, the better.
Specifically, do you have any specific suggestions about what progressives might do to move things along in our direction in the next few years?
I have lots of specific suggestions on that.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question was, do I have any specific recommendations for what progressives should do to move things forward? And I write a lot about that in the book. I write a lot about that on Open Left, my blog. I think that one thing is that I talk a little bit about in the book about how the difference between the progressive movement when I was in the Clinton White House and today. And one of the reasons I'm encouraged is that progressives today are working together much more than they did in the 90s. In the 90s, there were a bunch of single-issue groups who really didn't help each other very much at all. There was not a sense of common purpose, a common cause, and I think that's really changing. So I think the kind of cross-issue, cross-constituency work together is very important. I think it's central to us getting anything done. I think that online organizing, both at the local level and at the national level, is really key to getting things done. I also think it's our job in the progressive movement to really think bold and big, and to really push on these issues and keep reminding members of Congress and keep reminding the Obama administration that being cautious and careful is not going to get the job done right now, that we've got to really think big.
I'm so enthusiastic about Obama being in power, but speaking to what you were saying about your fear about reactions down the road, I listen to Tom Hartman religiously on Air American Radio, and he has Senator Sanders on Bernie Sanders on every week for an hour. For a whole hour, a U.S. Senator takes calls from folks all around the country, and basically they've been talking since October or September about how this global crisis is, I don't want to be a bummer in any way, but I think we all know it's really serious, is so much bigger than anyone will acknowledge, than anyone wants to talk about. The stock market doesn't want to acknowledge banks, but it's hundreds of trillions of dollars, and Bush and company saw it coming. And Bernie Sanders, U.S. Senator, deals with Obama all the time, said that they were putting the finger in the dike to hold it off until Obama gets in power, and then, or whoever, they almost didn't care, but, and then it will, it's going to be bad, is what I'm saying. What my concern is the Joe Plumbers, the knuckle, walkers, whatever, the Joe Plumbers need to be, how do we explain to the Joe Plumbers of this country that what's coming, whatever it is, might be wonderful, might be kind of serious. How does Obama is so masterful at languaging, but Pelosi and Reid and the other folks aren't. How do we sort of explain to them how what is handed to him is the effect of 30 years of Republican initiatives, laws, ways of governing, because they won't get it, and they will blame. And in 6 months they'll blame. We all know it's not going to be great in 6 months. So that's why I lose sleep every night, is how does he get help? He's alone messaging this, you know, it's like he's too fast to say, they handed me a pile of sewage. He's not going to say that. He says, well, you know, he's not a blame backwards, but it is 30 years, you know, and this is why I lose sleep, because there would be a backlash. Joe the Plumbers will say it's his fault, that, you know, so that's my concern. And I don't know if there's a historical context to it or what.
I think you're right to be very worried about it, and I think we've got to be very conscious about it. One of the things that I've written about in my blog is the fact that Obama is playing this conciliatory kind of role, conciliator in chief, basically, kind of role. That means that a bunch of the rest of us, both, Senate, House, other people in the administration, but also those of us with platforms on the outside, the writers, the local elected officials, movement leaders, are going to really have to be aggressive in going after these folks and play that role of continually reminding people that we got to this place because we deregulated everything. We did not watch the shop. We let folks run wild, and that it's almost exactly the same as what happened back in the 1920s, and that they need to take responsibility for that. I'm hopeful that can be done. I mean, the last couple of weeks I've heard Republicans mention Jimmy Carter 2 or 3 times, and it's reminded me, they've run against Jimmy Carter now for 30 years, right? We ought to be able to run against George Bush, who was, 50 times as bad for at least that long. So I really think we just got to keep pounding that message, and especially given that Obama is being the conciliator in chief.
Can I say something about money?
We have one more behind you.
Okay, I'm a banker, so I think I can say something about this. On the way over tonight, I was horrified to hear that Obama is thinking of loosening the restrictions on executive pay in the banking industry. I'm thinking, what is he thinking? There is a tremendous wave of revulsion among everyone, and I don't even want to use the word populist. What our financial executives have done to this country extracted enormous amounts of wealth to the benefit of themselves. And now they're saying, oh, but we need this, otherwise we'll go home and take our football with us. And I say, go home, please, please, get another job. And why is he protecting, the financial industry? I follow the money.
Exactly, always.
Well, I actually wrote a blog the other day that wasn't particularly eloquent, but I just wrote in big capital letters, let them fail, let them fail, let them fail. If they don't want to take our money, fine. Look, I think in every Democratic administration and in Congress, in Carter, in Clinton, and now in Obama, you basically have a debate between the neoliberals, the corporate folks, and the more progressive populist folks. And Obama has a lot of the neoliberals with him on the finance side of things, and unfortunately that's where the problem is. He does have some progressive-minded thinkers as well, and they're having those debates, and I really think that all of us have got to keep pushing on this idea and keep reminding Obama why he got elected, who elected him, because this is just an absolutely crucial issue. And I was glad to see Congress standing up on this executive pay thing. That Geithner has said he doesn't think that we should have any limits. He doesn't want to restrict the banks. And Chris Dodd got an amendment in the bill that was passed saying that we were going to absolutely have limits on executive pay and penalties for firms who screw around on this and take federal money.
I just have to say one thing. I couldn't believe what I was reading today on the HuffPost. Lindsey Graham, Republican, is saying we should keep nationalization of banks as an option.
Yeah.
And who was disagreeing with him? I can't believe it. Obama and Chuck Schumer. Oh, what a coincidence. Senator from New York, Obama the Brave.
Well, I think Obama has a theory of change that I think is going to play out for a little bit, and it's going to frustrate some of us, which is that he's trying to get the establishment to buy into his program of change. I think over time, one thing I like about Obama is he's a fast learner, and I think over time he's going to figure out these guys are going to continue to game the system and continue to screw with the American public, and that his views on that will change. And I also think the times will demand it. And I saw this on the stimulus bill itself. Back in December, there were economists who were writing, progressive economists, people on our side, the really strong, folks like Galbraith and Dean Baker, who were saying, this thing should be, should absolutely be 150 billion. And no less, it's got to be big. And then a couple weeks later, I started to see folks, Bob Borsage was coming out with reports saying it's got to be $450 billion, no less. It's got to be big. And then, as each week, it seemed like it would get a little bit bigger. And I think the solutions are going to have to be that way too on banking. On others, we're going to have to be thinking big. We're going to have to be thinking bold and reject the free market BS of the past.
I'm not trying to cut this too short, but we have a whole table full of books out there to buy, and Mike's willing to sign them. So I want to just take a minute and thank you, Mike, for being here, and thank all of you for all of your wonderful questions, and keep asking them. And we'll be here for probably about another half an hour or so. Is that correct, Keith?
Or longer, no hard deadline.
Okay, no hard deadline. As long as it's okay with Mercury. It's okay? Okay, so no hard deadline. All right.